Okay, so my name is Gabriele Kaiser and I'm editor-in-chief of ZDM Mathematics Education, and I would like to welcome you for this webinar of a special issue of ZDM, namely, in order to pronounce everything correctly, Conceptualizing Teachers' Interactions with Resources in Crossing Languages and Cultures. And before I hand over to Janine, who is actually chairing the webinar, I would like to share actually wonderful and for us really great news. Maybe you have heard that yesterday the new impact factor of the Web of Science have come out, and ZDM has actually raised once more the impact factor to 3.0. That means at average, we know, of course, average, each paper is quoted 3 times in a good journal. We are very, very pleased with this development because it sets actually ZDM as, yes, in comparison or in good comparison with ESM and GRME, who have a little bit higher or a little bit lower impact factors. Impact factors are not everything, and journalists have a responsibility for the development of the community. But of course, they are an important indicator how strong a journal is seen. So I'm very happy about the development, and I really would like to thank you all, the authors and the reviewers, and you all have in the past worked for ZDM and supported us. And I really would like to thank you for the hard work. We should always think we are not working for the publisher, we are working for our community. And I would think that is actually really important. So I'm very happy to have you here and to run this webinar. And just a quick note, that is my second remark. Actually, I remember that we had very strong discussions, yes, how broad the theme would be. And that was the reason why I was reading out the title when Luc approached me the first time and said, look, I want to have a special issue. Are you interested in? And then we had a long discussion, Luc, you probably remember, about, yes, how broad and how international it should be. So yeah. I'm very, very happy how broad and actually international this theme has come, the special issue has come up. Yes, so that was a very pleasant and very interesting and in parts a very challenging experience working with the 3 guest editors, Janine Remillard, Adler and Luc Trouche. And so I'm very happy now to hand over to Janine, who will chair the session. And yes, I look forward to working with all of you in the coming future.
Thank you, Gabrielle. And it was a pleasure working with you. We really appreciate your support. Welcome to everyone. Today's webinar, welcome to the webinar. And as Gabrielle already mentioned, our aim is to introduce the most recent issue of ZDM and generate a discussion about its focus, the conceptualization of mathematics teachers' interactions with resources when working across linguistic and cultural boundaries. I'm Janine Remillard, and I'm so pleased to be joining my colleagues and co-editors Luc Trouche and Jill Adler in today's seminar. Oh, I need to just put this on screen share. Now you see it in screen share, right? Or in full present mode, right?
No, it has
okay,
disappeared.
So let's.
Yeah, Johnny, it has disappeared.
Okay.
Disappeared.
And has it appeared?
That's better. That's better.
Perfect.
Now
okay. All right. So I'm so pleased to be joining Jill and Luc. It was a pleasure to work with them. I learned so much. This slide shows how we've structured the next 90 minutes. So after this overview, Luc Trouche, who really, as Gabrielle already suggested, was the true inspiration of the special issue, will share a bit about its aims and the impetus behind it. And then Jill and I will introduce some key takeaways from the survey paper, including 2 central themes that emerged and a conceptual map we developed to locate the entire set of papers in the issue. We'll then hear from authors of 3 illustrative papers. The presenters are Birte Specht, Mercy Kazima, and Takeshi Mayakawa. Each will have 12 minutes to present and then 3 minutes for questions. We'll then have approximately 15 minutes for open discussion, and then Jill will close us out with some final thoughts. There'll be times for a small number of questions between, but we've saved the bulk of the sort of interaction for the end. Along the way, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. Laura Condon from the University of Pennsylvania will be, and the lead author on one of the papers, will be monitoring the chat and sharing questions with us so that we can add them to the conversation. All right, Luc, take it away. Oh, Luc, we don't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Gabrielle and Janine, for your opening. And thank you all for being there. What I would like just to remind is that the issues of resources for teaching mathematics is both an old question, so textbooks are a good example of that, and a recent one due to the digitization of resources and to the awareness of the contrast between the abundance and the lack of resources in the profession, and the need to rethink the interaction of teachers with resources in different contexts. The starting point of this special issue was the awareness of the complexity of translating, of transposing a conceptual framework, in this case, a documentational approach didactics, DID, into a variety of languages. The DID multilingual project brought together about 50 researchers, including a number of participants to this seminar and in this special issue. I am very pleased to see you here, confronting about 15 languages, and each researcher trying to express the same concepts in this diversity of languages. This project leads to question, what does it mean in mathematics education to search for equivalence of concepts in different languages and in different curricular contexts? And this problem was particularly acute for languages whose structure was further away from French, such as Arabic or Chinese. Moreover, it was not only the possibility of correctly translating the concepts that was questioned, but also the relationships between those concepts and the very structure of those relationships, modeling the interaction of mathematics teachers with teaching resources. The desire to understand this complexity leads to adopt a broader point of view than DAD. The reason why, following the suggestion of Gabrielle, I solicited Jill and Janine, interested also in the study of teachers' interaction with resources, taking into account languages and cultures, and then constituting a team from 3 different research routes, 3 continents, 3 mathematics teaching contexts, and having developed 3 different models. And we shared a desire to enrich this team by soliciting authors who had already experienced these routes and proposing them a common questioning. How are teachers' interaction with resources interpreted and modeled across contexts? And what challenges and insights emerge? Yeah.
Thanks. I'm going to take over here and introduce you and talk to you a little bit about the survey paper. That's the first paper in the special issue. And to just share with you how difficult a task this was. Gabriella and Luc have both pointed to the complexity of the task we undertook, and we completely underestimated what this would be. We set off thinking we would be able to describe a field and explore a field, and that we would do it through concentric circles, starting with resources in the center, and then going out to languages, and from that out to culture. And we failed hopelessly in trying to make progress with that. We had many, many conversations. And it was only when we started to talk more in detail with each other about our own frameworks and our own work that we began to make progress, and that we decided that this would be a way in to actually constructing the survey paper. And so we don't represent a field. There isn't a single field to present. Thank you, Janine. So there's no single unified view of the field. We don't attempt to produce this or capture it, and we'll come back to that at the end of the seminar. So how we went about this was by articulating our three approaches. And what is clearly obvious about that, and I'm going to talk about the models in a minute, is that as soon as we did that, it was quite clear how each was historically and culturally located, and thus very important to talk about how language and culture were infused in the ways in which we approach teachers' interactions with resources. And it was a way into this complexity. So if you read the survey paper, you'll read the three stories, each of which culminates in a model. And it's the juxtaposition of the models towards the end of the survey paper that we're able to see, and we were able to articulate two clear themes, not yet, two clear themes that emerged from these. And I just want to briefly point to some aspects of the model before I go on to the themes. So each of the models shows a relationship between teachers and resources, which is obvious. That's what we were about. That's what we were doing. Each of it has a central construct, and they're different, from documentation, instrumentalization, to transparency, to curriculum as a relational, the relationship being a relational one. And so we were able to see both what was common and what was different. You can go on then, Janine. And that gave us an access to see two emerging themes. As we looked across the models, we were able to see what became visible and what was invisible. And also, because these are locally produced, but models are inherently general in their intent, we could see a local and global tension. So I'll talk first about the visibility-invisibility dialectic. What became immediately visible was not only that the teacher was central in all models, but that we shared a Vygotskian approach. A sociocultural approach was quite obvious across all across all three orientations. What was at the same time invisible while the teacher was visible was how the teacher was conceptualized in each of the models. So just a very brief example here. In France, the teacher has very strong agency, whereas in both South Africa and the US, the teacher's positioned as simultaneously the object as well as the agent of change. And so that shows us that when you're reading these models, there is a conception of the teacher built into them that's not immediately visible. And so we began to play with the visibility-invisibility dialectic. And certainly this emerges through language. And you will see, if you look at the models carefully, language is more and less present in each of them. And as we discussed them with each other, we actually went back and made adjustments to each of the models, because there were things that we thought they communicated, which they didn't. And so we were able to then foreground things that were not foregrounded before. I'm not going to go into further details with that, but rather invite you to read the paper and how these tensions and dialectics come to the fore. While we were able to see what was visible and invisible with language, culture was much more difficult. Culture's everywhere. It was everything about what we were doing was about culture, and at the same time, we could see this opens the space for hopefully what the special issue engenders, that it enables people to embark on future studies that bring out the differences in culture in both visible and invisible ways. In relation to the local and global tension, and I think as you read the papers, and I'm sure as you'll hear the presentations coming, there is a deep tension between what we call the local and the global. So each of the models attempts to communicate something general, something that can be used by others in other contexts. But at the same time, it emerges in a very specific cultural location, and it's infused with that cultural specificity. So as it's used and taken and used in another context, it requires delocation and relocation. It requires a reinterpretation of what resources and teachers and language and culture mean, and what the various aspects of the frameworks mean in a new cultural and linguistic location. And what that opens up is an enormous question about, well, what are the ethics of this delocation and relocation? What are we doing when we use other frameworks and use them to describe and work with teachers in a very specific location and a very different one? And it raises ethical implications, and we discuss some of those in the paper. And it also raises the big question, which has been talked about quite a lot in our community, and we raise it again, and we think it's ever present with us, that there is a question of whose local becomes the global, and what are the consequences of that for our work.
Thanks, Jill. So as the papers came in and through the iterative process on the survey paper that Jill just described, three main foci began to take shape. The first, navigating between languages and models about resources, focuses on translating frameworks and researchers and teachers talk across languages and cultures. So work under this focus illustrates how developing research frameworks is a cultural practice of naming and conceptualizing aspects of teaching. And these practices themselves are deeply grounded in culture. Adopting and translating frameworks, and this is what Jill was just referring to, across contexts, as in the DAD multilingual project and others, involves attending to the relationships between culture and language. The second focus, languages and cultures as resources, focuses on the issue of language as a resource for communicating and negotiating meaning within and across contexts. This focus embraces the multilingual nature of many classrooms and examines communicative practices in relation to developing mathematical meanings. It also embraces the multilingual and thus cultural nature of research on teachers' and students' interactions with resources. And the third, languages and cultures of resources, acknowledges resources as artifacts of culture and components of the social practices surrounding their use. This focus highlights how textbooks, curriculum materials, and other resources are carriers of cultural meaning, including what mathematics is valued and how teachers and students are positioned in the process. So this slide shows how we, with the help of the authors, placed each of the 13 contributions in relation to these three foci. We realize that there are other representations of the space that are possible depending on one's point of view. And even how one reads the papers. Many of the papers, as you can see by the placement, explore at least two of the foci, while one is downplayed, but others, particularly those that are closer to the center, touch on all three foci in some way. And actually, as the papers developed through the review process, it seemed to us that they moved a little bit closer to the center and began to touch on all on more closer to all three foci. So today, as I said earlier, we're going to hear from three authors, but first I want to just check with Laura if there are any questions, specific questions about what we've shared so far.
There's nothing that's come up in the chat, and I don't see any hands raised. If anybody has any questions before we move on and wants to ask now.
Okay, so I think we'll keep moving. Let me go on to the next slide. So in today's session, you'll be introduced to these three papers. The paper by Michèlle, Artigue, and colleagues explores language as a resource for teachers describing mathematics classroom teaching and learning. The paper by Mercy Kazima and colleagues examines the teaching of the concept of zero in Malawi primary schools, and the paper by Changyang Wang and colleagues explores issues that arise when translating the DAD framework into Chinese and Japanese. And the cultural elements of that. We selected these three papers for today's seminar because they're located in different places on the map, as you can see, and thus they attend to different focuses. They also represent different languages and cultures, and they showcase work taking place on different continents. So here you are on the map right now. Luc, does this fit with what you wanted? This is Luc's idea. We will begin with the paper by Artigue and colleagues presented by Birte Specht.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
You're going in and
Hello,
out a
can you hear
little
me?
bit. Yes.
Yes, now you can
Yeah.
hear me?
Yes.
Have you ever had problems finding the right words or translation problems? If English is not your native language, then you probably know the following dilemma. You want to express something in English, and somehow there is no term that exactly matches what you want to say. In German, there is the term roter Faden. If I speak literally of a red thread of a classroom, it is probably not really clear what I mean. The sense of the term red thread is main topic. However, in this translation, nuances of the term are lost. This problem is even more critical in mathematics education, where nuances often matter. To make this problem a little smaller, we conducted the following study. Yeah, my name is Birte Specht from Oldenburg, Germany, and we work together on this study and paper as a team of 4 with my colleagues, Michèlle Artigue from Paris, France, who can't be with us today for medical reasons, Cristine Knipping from Bremen, Germany, and Jamila Novotná from Prague, Czech Republic. The title of our paper is Language as a Resource for Teachers, Describing Mathematics Classroom Teaching and Learning, a Comparative Approach. So we deal with the question of language as a resource for teachers describing classroom practice with an international perspective. Next slide, please. Our study is based on the consequence of vocabulary education, languages, and cultures. The central of this project was what terms the teachers used to describe phenomena of the middle school mathematics classroom. This vocabulary reflects their practice, characteristic structures, and in this way reveals cultural and linguistic specifics in different countries. In the project, national teams of researchers and experienced teachers used a common set of classroom videos to stimulate recognition of familiar terms. This resulted in 10 lexicons, which are summarized and described in the book shown above. The book has the potential to enrich the professional vocabulary of mathematics teachers around the world by providing access to sophisticated classroom practices named by teachers in different countries. An example, in the German lexicon, we have the terms Hausaufgabenvergleich and Auswertung, which mean comparing homework and comparing results. These terms express appreciation for students' work and allow for different ways and answers that are considered correct. In French, this is called correction, which focuses mainly on correctness. Do French teachers describe phases of comparing homework really in such a poor way? So these lexicons provide insight into cultural and linguistic characteristics of language describing classroom practice. Nevertheless, some specifics cannot be adequately represented by isolated terms. This is where our study of narratives comes in. Next slide, please. In our study, we want to understand and compare more deeply how language functions as a resource in different cultural and linguistic contexts. We want to achieve deeper insight into how teachers use language to describe mathematics classrooms. Therefore, we considered how to capture these deeper insights, which led us to the idea of examining language via narratives, a methodology not very common in math education research. Narratives as texts about teaching and learning written by teachers and researchers. Thus, the research question of our study is, how does a cultural comparative approach of narratives help us to understand language as a resource for teachers describing mathematics classroom teaching and learning? Next slide. To illustrate our approach, we show a simplified overview here. A more sophisticated figure can be found in the paper. Above the dashed line, you will find the lexicon project, for which we have only shown the 3 countries that participated in our narrative study. As we said, classroom videos were used to create national lexicons of terms and categories. Here, we started with our narrative study. National teams of teachers and researchers described the video classrooms in the form of narratives. To use the respective national lexicon where deemed appropriate to them. In this way, each national 3 narratives, 1 French, 1 the Czech, 1 about the German video classroom. Thus, 3 different cultural and linguistic perspectives of the same classroom. Since these narratives are very extensive, we selected episodes, meaning sections that are significant or typical. Regarding these episodes, we compared the terms and categories used. Next slide. Now we would like to give you some insights into the results of these comparisons. It has become clear that the understanding of language as a resource is very complex. Linguistic and cultural differences that have become apparent through the narratives can be summarized as follows. The Czech narratives focus on teaching methods, interactions, visible actions, and do rarely address mathematical activities. The French narratives focus on mathematical didactic management as well as detailed descriptions of mathematical activities. The German narratives describe clearly the mathematical content, the structure of the lesson, and the management of expected and unexpected learning opportunities. Although clear differences exist between the narratives, they are not contradictory, but provide complementary and mutually enriching perspectives. Next slide, please. We would like to present 2 concrete examples to illustrate this. In the narratives, it is clear that technical terms help to depict more precisely what is happening. Next step, yeah. Let us come back to the German terms, Hausaufgabenvergleich, comparing homework, and Auswertung, comparing results. These terms emphasize that the students' work and results are appreciated. As we said, the French term correction refers more to the fact that wrong answers are rectified. Now, however, the French narrative writes a German didactic incident. It is that the teacher uses the correction situation to deepen students' understanding. This is an example of how the use of technical language might be adapted in narratives in order to better capture the didactic intentions and techniques in situ. Narratives seem to be closer to what is at stake in a situation compared to technical terms alone. Second example. Next, yeah, thank you. Technical terms are closer to everyday language in German than in other languages. Often technical terms in the German language are composed of everyday terms, which makes it possible to deduce their meaning. In addition, they often have concrete material meanings. Zusammenfassung, summary, is composed of zusammen, together, and fassen, grasp, and includes the concrete meaning to physically grasp something. This physical meaning is not apparent in the French, the Czech, and the English terms. These characteristics may make the discourse of researchers more distant from the teacher's professional discourse, and these terms less visible narratives, even if understood by teachers and reasonably familiar for them. Next slide. Let us now take a brief look at methodological insights. Narratives are cultural objects that have rarely been used in comparative mathematics education research. They have proven to be highly fruitful in answering our research question. Insofar, this method can be a suitable tool for other questions as well. In a lexicon and descriptive narratives work together to offer a more presentation of teachers within different cultural contexts, which can bring teacher perspectives and that thus a resource. Finally, we would like to address in the next slide the topic of visibility and invisibility. This dialectic is evident in our study. On the one hand, the lexicons and the narratives make professional language more visible and tangible. We don't make everything visible, but allude to it, hint at it, and know there is more. On the other hand, language is not always visible. Language is used in the narratives to make clear which didactic decisions, which intentions and mathematical interactions were focused on. Then language is used in an invisible way to make cultural differences visible. In this respect, we move precisely along this dialectic of making language perceptible as a resource, on the one hand by making it directly visible, and on the other hand by grasping its meaning through its invisible use. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting us to present our study, and thank you very much for your attention. We hope we gave you a first impression of our paper and motivate you to read it.
Thank you, Birte. You did an excellent job on time. So we have several minutes for questions, and I see one multi-layer question in the chat. Yes, and so Sammy, do you want to just turn on your mic and ask maybe one of your questions? There's a lot in this chat.
Thank you for having me and give me the chance, and thank you for the informative presentation that we have heard today. And just I know that it's an interesting topic to see the effect of languages on the mathematics classroom, and I would like to know more if there's a comparison between different languages on the mathematics, and also as you know that we have individually differences in all students and teachers, in all types of differences, especially for language. We know the expressive languages from the teachers and the receptive languages from the students, and that's the gap between both teachers and students is going to make differences on the. It's going to have an impact on the students' learning or on the learning process inside the classroom. My question here: have you ever made the comparison between the receptive and expressive languages? And also, do you have any idea about the foreign students or students who have difficulties or disabilities on their languages, and how that may affect their mathematical learning? Thank you.
So you're raising questions about different types of language that students use in the classroom. Birte, do you, or I see that Cristine also has her hand up. So Christine, did you want to
Yes,
respond to that?
in this,
Or
Christine.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, and these are very interesting questions you're raising. In this particular project, we were focusing on teachers' language when they are talking about the classroom. So it's not about the language in the classroom happening, but the professional language that teachers might have to talk about what is happening in the classroom. And so I think we did encounter informal language that teachers used, beside technical terms they were using. But I don't think we encountered slang language when we were talking to teachers about about classrooms, or we didn't encounter specific mathematical language when talking about the classroom, but more professional language talking about what they were describing in the classroom. And partly that might be part of it, a little bit mathematical language, but that's not the focus.
and there are other papers in the special issue that do look at language in the classroom. So you might be interested in looking at some of those. Many of those are up in the upper left-hand side of the map when you see the full map. So I think there are examples of researchers looking at how language is used and navigated in classrooms. Thank you, Birte and Christine, also for that response. We are now going to move to the next paper. So here we are on the map. Here's an example. This paper does look a little bit more closely at language in the classroom, but focusing on teachers' language. This paper is by Mercy Kazima and colleagues, and Mercy is going to present the paper.
Thank you, Janine. Our paper is on teaching the concept of zero in a Malawi primary school, and we are illuminating the language and resource challenge. I am Mercy, and my colleagues Anna, Lisnet, and Fraser are in the audience. Next slide, please. We start with a brief introduction. Teaching the concept of zero is complex. It is complex even in all contexts, and even more challenging in a linguistic context like Malawi, where English is used as official language. English was a colonial language, and it continues to be used as official language, and it is used in schools from upper primary onwards. We studied the teaching of zero in Malawi's grade 1. This is where the first year of primary, and that's where zero is introduced to children. The first grade in Malawi, they start at age 6 years. So this is the first time they're encountering the concept of zero. The teaching is in Chichewa from the grade 1 and up to grade 4, or other local language. Chichewa is a national language, so it is widely used. But in places where it is not the home language, there can be other languages used. So for Chichewa, there is no number name for zero. But for the other numbers, they do have number names for zero. For the resources that the teachers use, the textual resources are the syllabus, the teacher guide, and the textbook. So we have the syllabus and the teacher guide in English, and the textbook is in Chichewa, and the teaching is in Chichewa. Next slide, please. We use the Mediating Primary Mathematics Framework by Venkat and Askew to explore the language and the resources two focal teachers used and how they use these. We explored through lesson observations, through interviews with the teachers, and document analysis. We focused on 3 strands of the framework: the artifacts, which are the physical objects that they were brought to the classroom. And we also focus on inscriptions, these are the writings that the teachers did during the lesson, and the talk, what they said, and also the gestures. Now, the findings. In terms of resources and language, what was used? We found that they use artifacts, physical resources such as stones, sticks, leaves, and boxes. And they also used inscriptions, which were mostly drawings, which they did during the lesson. And they also had talk, where they were naming zero. They had gestures. For example, the empty hand gesture, we do this to show that there is nothing. And we also look at how these were used. They were placing 1, 2, 3, or 0 objects in compartments, then counting how many in each. By that, we mean they would have a box like with compartments and have 1 stick in one compartment, 2 sticks in the second compartment, 3 sticks in the third compartment, and no sticks in the fourth compartment. Then children were asked to count how many in each of these compartments. So where there was no object, that was related to 0. For the numbers 1, 2, and 3, they were using the Chichewa number names to call them. There are so many objects, 1 object, 2 objects in the Chichewa number names. But for 0, since there's no number name, they were using the words Mulibe or Paribe, which mean nothing. And that was used for 0. It is important to look at what was used and how they were used, because some of the resources that were used and some of the language that was used offered affordances or challenges. By affordances, we mean there were opportunities to learn the concept of 0 in the mathematical meaning. So here we'll look at some examples. If you look at the picture on the left, these are circles drawn on the floor. The teacher had children in groups, and for each group, she drew 4 circles for them on the floor, in the classroom, on the floor. And she put 1 stone in the circle labeled A, and 2 stones in a circle labeled B, 3 stones in a circle labeled C, and no stone in the last circle labeled D. And then she asked children in each group to count how many stones are there in each of these circles. And the children were counting to say there is 1, there's 2 stones, there are 3 stones, and then there is nothing in the D circle. The other example on the right is what a teacher drew on the chalkboard. She drew boxes A, B, C, and D, as you can see. And she was using, that is a pointer, and she drew cups. 1 cup in the first one, 2 cups, 3 cups, and no cup. And then she was using that pointer to count together with the children, to say, let's count how many cups are in A, and they would count how many in B, how many in C, and how many in the last box D, where there was nothing. And these resources and the language that was used provided affordances to learn 0 if the language emphasized on no objects, to say there are no stones in D, there are no cups in D. That meant there are 0 cups and there are 0 stones. So it offered opportunity to learn 0 as a number, because 0 was the number of cups that was in D, and 0 was the number of stones that was in D. Next slide, please. We look at another example. This one is one where there were challenges. It's an example of where the resource and the language used limited the learning of 0 as a number. So this is where the teacher used bottles as the resource, and she put water in 1 bottle, and the other bottle was empty. And she held them up high in front of the class, as you can see, and she asked, what is in this bottle? And the children said, there's water. And then she said, what about this other bottle? And the children said, it is empty. And then she related that emptiness, then having nothing in the other bottle, to say that is zero. So the meaning of zero was left at the level of absence and emptiness, which is the everyday meaning of zero. It did not move to the mathematical meaning of zero as a number. Having the water or any liquid in the bottle, which is not countable, didn't make it possible for the children to look at the empty bottle as zero objects. It was just referred to as empty. If there were like stones or other countable objects in the bottle, like 3 stones, then they could have counted there are 3 stones in one bottle and there are no stones in the other bottle. And the meaning of zero would have moved from the everyday meaning to the mathematical meaning of zero as a number. We also found that the teachers struggled with the language and naming of zero. And another finding was that moving between English and Chichewa was complex for the teachers. The teachers found it difficult to use the textual resources in English and move to the textbook in Chichewa and teach in Chichewa. So that movement, they reported that they found that very difficult to do. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, our paper illustrates at least 3 things that we see. We think it illustrates that resources and language are complex in teaching mathematical concepts, especially difficult concepts such as zero. We also see that our paper illustrates that the language of textual resources is underestimated in post-colonial contexts like Malawi, where it is assumed that the resources can be written in English and the teachers can move between the English in the resources and the teaching in Chichewa without problems. And we also see that our paper illustrates that there are implications for research. As the editors of this special issue have mentioned in the survey paper, this area is under research, and we need further research in this to inform us. There are also implications for curriculum material development. The curriculum materials suggest things. I should say here that the bottle which the teacher used in that example where they had challenges was suggested in the curriculum materials. But the teacher guide did not say how to use that bottle. So the curriculum materials can be more explicit in what resources to use and how to use them, what language to use and how to use the language to convey the mathematical meaning, so that we move from the everyday meaning to the mathematical meaning. We also see that the paper illustrates that there are implications to teacher education. For those of us in teacher education, we think there's more we can do to support our teachers, to prepare them better, to interact with the resources and to interact with the language and to teach the mathematics in a meaningful way. Next slide, please. Now, finally, we just want to position ourselves in the special issue. This has already been done by the editor, but we just want to highlight that we are placed where we are because we have looked at language and culture as resources by showing what was used and what language is used in teaching zero in the context of Malawi. We also have a focus on language and cultures of resources by highlighting the importance of the language of resources as we teach mathematics. The last slide.
I think, oh yes, you have a nice thank you slide. Yes. Great.
Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mercy. I think we have a number of questions and comments in the chat, and some are more complex than others. Laura, can you identify one question that you think is specific to Mercy's paper that she might speak to?
Sure, absolutely. I think there are a few that kind of go along together in terms of thinking about the concept of zero, which is complex in and of itself for students as they're learning it. And I think that was one of the questions in terms of considerations for the linguistic maturity of children's learning and the concept of zero. And so how teachers, if you think there's an effect of that linguistic maturity for how teachers approach the understanding of the concept.
Oh, you want me to answer now?
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you could. Yeah,
okay.
I mean, or just give your thoughts about it. Yeah.
Yeah, there is something there, but also we have to start somewhere, because at that point where the language is introduced, the children already know about the other numbers, and they already know something about nothing. So they can be told there's nothing here and so on. But the teaching now, we want it to move from that nothingness to something, to be a number. So finding the right language to make them see that the nothing is called zero, but zero is a number, that's where the problem is. So I agree that there's maturity that is needed, but there's also language that can be used for children to understand that. If we don't use the right language, then they remain at the everyday meaning of nothing as empty or nothing as absence.
And then, Janine, do we have time for one more question? One more.
Are you thinking of this last one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Why don't you do that? Because
Do
I
you
was. Yeah.
You
so
can
the
go ahead and read it because there are more
well,
popping up. So now I'm not sure if we're thinking of the same last one.
Well, so zero as a number name doesn't exist in Malawi, and I think that's what there's a question about. I'm curious to know if in Malawi culture zero is as a number is present.
No, I don't think it's present. What is present is the nothing. So
Yeah. The everyday meaning.
Like the other numbers have a structure in the Chichewa number names. They actually has a base 5 structure and base 10 structure at the same time. There is no place for zero in that number structure. So culturally, it's not there, but the meaning of nothing is there. Yeah.
This is fascinating. Yeah. I have lots of questions about curriculum materials, but we're going to stop and move on to the next paper. Thank you very much, Mercy, for just showing us this really important work. So here we are on the map. We're moving to China and Japan. Thank you, Laura, for applauding. So next we're going to hear from our final group. The Wang et al. Paper is going to be presented by Takeshi Mayakawa.
Hi, can you hear me? It works.
Mm-hmm.
So, hello, I'm Takeshi Miyakawa from Japan. And this paper was written as a result of the collaborative work carried out with the Chinese and Japanese colleagues here at Chunyan Wang, Yusuke Shino, and Binyan Q. This is about the translation of our theoretical framework into our languages. So next slide, please. So as a background context of our paper, there was a DAD multilingual project, which has been already mentioned by in the introductory talk. The 4 authors of this paper were engaged in this project and translated the DAD framework into Chinese and Japanese languages. And during this translation, we had a lot of difficulties. It was really a hard work. So using these difficulties, we decided to investigate cultural specificities of teachers and researchers' work related to the resources, especially the differences between West and East and between China and Japan. So this is therefore exploratory work concerning the translation work we may often find in the research community of the East. So our study adopts as a theoretical framework the anthropological theory of the didactic, ATD. So from this perspective, we can conceptualize our work like the diagram given here. I explain here three important concepts of ATD we used in this study. Those are praxeology, transposition, and the ecology. So the first concept, important concept, the praxeology is a model of human activity that consists of two components: the praxis block that describes the human practices and the logos block that describes the knowledge behind the practices. In our work, the critical praxeology is a didactic praxeology that models teachers' work, which is an object of study of DAD. And also another important praxeology is a research praxeology, because this praxeology model researchers' work. Actually, the theoretical framework we translated is a part of the logos block of research praxeology in the West. And another important concept is a transposition. This concept has been initially introduced to understand the nature of mathematics, which could be found in the curriculum. But in our case, we consider that the translation of a theoretical framework is considered as a process of transposition. So the translation could be understood as transposition. And the third important concept is the ecology. This concept models the cultural factors of different levels that support or hinder the transposition process. The term condition and constant are usually used in this framework. In our case, we consider that the system of condition and constant produced the difficulty of translation we had, and also the nature of research and didactic praxeology in the East Asian countries. Yeah. So we consider that the investigation of the issue of translation of transposition allow us to shed light on the differences of the nature of the praxeology and ecology between West and East and between China and Japan. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the research question we posed within this framework in this paper was twofold. The first question was, what are the common and different institutional conditions and constraints that cause the difficulty in the translation work of DAD, especially between East and West and between China and Japan? And the second research question was, what are the critical cultural specificities highlighted through exploring the transposition process of the research praxeology of DAD? To answer this question, I cannot present the detail of our methodology, but I refer to two important analytical tools. The first one is a tool of ATD related to the ecology. It is a level of didactic codeterminacy, which allows us to classify the cultural elements of different levels, such as humanity, civilization, society, school, etc. And the second important perspective is a perspective of translation studies. This is not from the mathematics education research, but from the linguistic research. This perspective allows us to frame the translation issues. For example, the concept of equivalence between source and target text, and the concept of translation shift. So we use this tool to analyze our difficulties. The next slide, please. Let me now present some issues of translation we had. There are different kinds of issues, but one important issue for us was to create new terms for technical terminologies due to the linguistic distance, such as inexistence of one-to-one correspondence, that means no equivalence between Western and Eastern terms, and also the grammatical differences of the rules of the derived word, and so forth. For example, even the term document and instrument, those are not easy for us, but the term like documentation and documentational, or the term like instrumental, instrumentation, instrumentalization, those are so difficult terms. We had a much difficulty to create a new term for them. And also, even if we found a word at the literal or contextual level of the given English or French word, we sometimes face other issues owing to cultural differences, such as teachers' terminology, education researchers' terminology, researchers' perspective, and so on. So let me explain with an example. In the case of the term resource, which is a main keyword in DAD. So next slide, please. In the research praxeology, the terminology is part of the theoretical framework. In the case of DAD, different terms or concepts are used to investigate teachers' work. The term resource has been translated into ziyuan in Chinese and resource in Japanese. Here, there was a linguistic constraint. In the Japanese case, we abandoned to find the Japanese term and used the phonetic expression of resource as a translation. So in Japanese, it's a resource. While in China, they didn't have this option to use phonetic expression due to the linguistic constraint. They use a phonetic expression just for the person's name. So they decided to use a cross term ziyuan as its translation. In any case, what is important here is that these terms, ziyuan and resource, are not very natural, rather alien for the teacher and also for the researchers in the East. In the teachers' community in China and Japan, there are other terms that describe something similar to resource. Could you just click? For example, kyōzai and kyogu in Japanese, and there is also a specific term implying teachers' practices with resources, that is kyōzai kenkyu. This is almost same in China. Could you click, please? What is interesting here is that in addition to the teacher's work, there are also researchers' practices specific to the Chinese and Japanese context. In the case of Japan, the researchers usually use a terminology closer to the teacher's one, and their practices are often oriented towards developmental studies. That is to say, there is a strong or close relationship between didactic praxeology and research praxeology. And they sometimes share the logos block, that means some concept. Because of this, our translation resource may be difficult to be incorporated into our research praxeology because we had already the original concept, which is close to the teacher's praxeology. So next slide, please. So in this way, we have analyzed the transposition process of different key terms and identified different cultural specificities of teachers' work as well as researchers' work. I provide in this slide some remarks we had as a conclusion. So regarding the condition and constraint in the translation work, language was one of the biggest constraints that caused difficulty of translation and shapes the theoretical concept of DAD, which is transposed into the West. And we often face translation shift, which means a formal discrepancy between the source and target text. For example, in the case of documentation. And also, we found that the local context of teachers' practices constitute a constraint when choosing the translation term, which led to the consideration of how the translated term would be received by the teacher in each country. And also regarding the praxeology in the East, we could find some cross relationship between research praxeology and didactic praxeology. This is something I have already explained. So the last slide, next slide, please. Okay, So finally, this slide, the last slide, is to try to contribute a discussion on the two emerging themes of the special issues. So regarding the invisibility and visibility dialectic, so I think the translation issues highlight the existence of mostly invisible condition constraints that shape researchers and teachers' work in a given context, such as language and education culture. And also these issues highlight their local cultural specificity, not necessarily visible for the people outside context, but also the people inside context, like such as the similarities rather than the differences between China and Japan, the close relationship between researchers and teachers' work. And regarding the local and global tension, another emerging theme of special issue, I think the theoretical idea of the didactic codeterminacy is critical at this point. From this perspective, there exist different levels between the local and global level. For example, our case study is related to the levels of humanity, civilization, society, and school. And one tension which seems interesting was related to the theoretical framework. On the one hand, the theoretic framework is a global object that is expected to reveal the mechanism of didactic phenomenon beyond the society or civilization. So it could be at the level of humanity. But on the other hand, the translation of a theoretical framework and its use across countries context required to take into account the local context, such as language, researchers' work, and teachers' work, which will be situated at the level of civilization, society, or school level. Okay, that's all. This is our presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Takeshi. I'm not sure, so we have about 1 minute. Is there a question, Laura, that might be?
There's one question that's very specific, and then there's one that's a little bit broader into about translation and the functioning of language.
So let's hold off on the second one, because after this, we'll go into open conversation. And so maybe that could come up then. So why don't you ask the specific one?
So Matt asked how, if at all, the explicit use of katakana as a way of showing that a concept might be foreign differ from how a translation into Hanzi is read by researchers and practitioners.
Takeshi, are you able to follow that question? Or
So the katakana is something we use for express foreign languages. So in the case of resource, we decided to use this term resource. But in general, in Japan, we often use this in this way, but in China, the people hesitate to use such kind of expression. So, but as I said, I think this way of using the new term is not something very natural, even for the Japanese people. So we need to explain what does this mean. So that means that this term is something a little bit alien for the researchers and even for the teachers.
Thank you. So thank you for your presentation. We now can move to, we have about 15 minutes for general questions and discussion across the paper and the special issue in general. And if you were able to raise your hand in Zoom, let me just get back to this. I would be able to see it. So maybe, and Laura, maybe you can help also monitor questions. or should we go to the question in the chat that was more complex that you mentioned?
I think perhaps we could start off with Alexander's question. I don't know if he wants to ask it himself rather than me reading it.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask a more general question on linguistic theory, and the question is as follows. Linguistic theory obviously can offer valuable insights into comprehensively examining the functioning of language. And what I wanted to ask is, do you believe that we should delve deeper into the features of translation work within the realm of mathematical education? And is it perhaps worth it to conduct an empirical study or an experiment?
So that's an excellent question. And one thing that I'll point out is that there is one paper in the special issue by Kenneth Ruthven that looks at translation. But really, this is a discussion. So I think that's an excellent question. Does somebody want to speak to that question? Jill, it makes you, if you're, well, Kenneth wants to speak.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
very
Kenneth.
quickly to say that what that paper does is, in the first half, it outlines some key concepts from translation studies, and it relates them to various kinds of translation work that are relevant to mathematics education. And in the second half of the paper, it does a case study of an actual translation, the translation between English and French of the document setting out the DAD framework. So in a sense, that paper has started to do what you have asked about, but I think it's very interesting, the possibility of putting translation within our field, to stepping back and looking more carefully at the translation process and at translations.
Mm-hmm. I would also add that the Wang et al. Paper that Takeshi just presented, I think adds more complexity, thinks about contextual translation, transposition. So when you're moving a framework into a different context, and other papers do this as well, one has to understand how the context receives the theories and concepts in the framework, or doesn't receive, doesn't have space for. And so I think a number of the papers really help us understand that translating theories and frameworks is not simply a matter of getting the terms right. And I think Kenneth's paper also begins that conversation. Matt, you have your hand up.
Yes, and so I want to just point out that this notion of translation is something that has kind of been, at least in the circles that I'm in, has kind of been swept under the rug. If you are working off of people like Piaget and Vygotsky, who did not write in English, as far as I'm aware. And so it is kind of this existential question, I feel, of, well, if we've been taking these translations from French and Russian kind of for granted for so long, then what does this stuff that we've been talking about for the last hour and so imply?
I think that's a really important question or comment. I mean, it has implications for how a field like mathematics education also connects with other fields. We can't operate in a silo, but we really need to understand our work as it's understood from a linguistic perspective. Kenneth, did you want to speak to that?
Very quickly, even if people speak the same language, this happens. So in my paper, I look at how Vergniaud took terms which clearly came from Piaget, but Vergniaud explains that he's recontextualized these terms. And of course, that again, those were recontextualized by Rabardel. So even if we're all speaking French, the actual meaning and reference of terms shifts as theories develop. So this is not something that's just about translation between languages, it's translation or recontextualization within a language.
Thank you. Gabrielle?
I think we have really touched many different perspectives, and one is of course about translations. And I mean, now with ChatGPT coming up, it will be even getting a bigger problem. And of course, we have this more technical problem of translation. And I mean, we have a very, I think, for at least from a German perspective, famous example of the books by Felix Klein, mathematics. It was translated, the title, Mathematics from an Advanced Standpoint, which did, in our view, not capture the right meaning. So Springer actually paid for a new translation for EP 13, and we went back to the new title from math education, mathematics from a higher standpoint. So that is a very subtle difference, and still it makes such a big meaning. A difference, and I think that is actually what we have in mind, that even slight differences make a great difference. And I think we have to go back, as Matt just maybe proposed, that I had in mind to propose, that we have to go back actually to original, to classical work, seminal work, and see whether we can get newer translations, trying actually to keep closer to the meaning. I mean, that is one important aspect. And another important aspect is what we have discussed, or you have discussed in this whole special issue, the dominance of language over ethnical and about, ethnical problems, about how actually languages hide learning difficulties, and that we are actually have many difficulties when we carry out comparative empirical studies. How actually can we really translate the different language of the students, of the teachers, and the theoretical frameworks. So I think it shows up, actually this special issue left me with more questions and need to further research, because you have pointed out so many important questions. So that is where I really wanted to thank the guest editors for this important work.
I think I'd like to add to this discussion of translation and thinking about sort of getting translations right is one issue. I have a colleague in educational linguistics who argues that it's in the miscommunication and then the conversation in order to create, to sort of clarify what's being communicated, that deeper meaning emerges. And so I think, one of the things that we learned as we looked across all of these papers is how local meanings are. And so in order so thinking about translation is an important thing, but also translation is the first step in communication and meaning making within a community. And I think that's something that surfaces in a lot of these you will also notice that the authors on many of the papers are cross-cultural, cross-language teams. And so communication even across those teams is really important. Yeah, Takeshi.
Yeah, I have just one comment about the translation. So the translation of the theoretical framework, it is related. Yeah, there's some difficulties, but I think we need to also think about the practices of researchers who use the theoretical framework, because it's not only the theoretical part, but also the practical part could be important in terms of praxeology. So for example, in the lexicon project, they look at the teachers' professional languages. So these professional languages are characterized by the teacher's professional practices. So not only the theoretical part, but also a practical part could be important.
Yeah, yes, and that your paper really highlights how even the role of the researcher is conceptualized in this. Gabrielle?
Just on a technical question, of course, I've seen in the chat that there was a question whether early career researchers can participate in it. I mean, we have tried to distribute this invitation very widely. So, but of course, everybody could have shared this invitation. So it's a very open event. You didn't need a password. So yes, please, if you hear about it, simply pass the invitation on to early career researchers. And as we are actually recording the presentations, you will find that in about a week at the website of ZTM. So I think that is actually a way of trying to get in communication between authors and readers. Usually we read what authors have told us, and that is a chance to get into touch. So I'm very happy that this series has now started to run, and we intend to continue.
So, and you intend to have a seminar with each special issue as it comes out?
Probably not with each special issue, because it's actually quite a lot of work, and not all editors may be interested.
Okay.
But if guest editors are interested in, we certainly will do so. We have already planned 2 more in this year. So
I'm thinking that what I'm realizing is you have to be connected in order to receive the invitation from the one that came out from ZDM. It went to all ZDM authors. We also sent one out through the Jerry Becker distribution list. And so I think it's really important for us as a community to think about how early career researchers are connected to those things. And so when we get to the end, the last slide has our email addresses on it. So if there's anyone who wants to know how to get connected to the Jerry Becker distribution email, which I think international is distributed internationally, I can help you with that. You can just email me.
Yeah, I think Jerry Becker list is actually in honor of still existing although Jerry Becker has passed away, and yeah.
All right, this has been a really rich presentation and discussion. I'm going to hand it over to Jill now to wrap us up.
Thanks. So just some concluding thoughts, some final thoughts, listening to everything and reading the questions and the comments that have come. I mean, just something that I think is obvious, but we don't always state it, is that this whole episode, the journal issue, the discussions we've had, every paper is all in English. And I would imagine that the majority of people on this call, on this Zoom at the moment, are not main language English speakers. So there's the active translation happening while we're working and recontextualization. And it is an issue in the field that there's such a global dominant language that impacts all our work. So I'm going to make a few comments that come to mind, because I think they're all important. They're not necessarily in any order, but I do want to pick up the issue about young and early researchers, because one of the things that early researchers face is using other frameworks. That's the first thing they do, is you don't just construct your own, go and have a look at what's out there. And I think before I started this work on this issue, the special issue, I was not aware of how much work is involved in recontextualizing those and thinking about what's involved in the act of using one or trying to use one. And I think we could, all of us in various ways, help early researchers understand that the struggles they're facing are these acts of translation and recontextualization, and how important this is. And we hope that through this issue, we've sparked off actually what will be wider and wider studies related to this. So that was one comment. There's also been quite a lot of comments a little bit about language and language structures. We didn't really focus on that because we were looking at teachers' use of resources and work that came out of that initially. Of course, there's a lot of work in the community about how language structures thinking and in dialectical ways, but it's not really part of the study per se, though many of the papers will be taking up issues of translation of various language and language structures. There certainly is one of the papers where doctoral students are trying to translate and are dealing with different structures in the language they're working with and the language of the framework. There was also interesting work on words, and we use words all the time and make assumptions about their meanings, like zero, like empty, like nothing. And what was interesting about the 3 papers selected is that we were looking at word use in the classroom and mathematical word use, like zero. We were looking at teaching practices, word use as teachers talk about their own work, and then we were working on, in the 3rd presentation, was on researchers' word use as they describe and develop models. And each of those, as Takeshi said, is a different practice and a different set of cultures and discourses that infuse those. So our work is complex, we can't get away from that. And we hope that through the special issue, we've alerted us once again, because I think these are not unknown ideas, they're just making them visible, things that were perhaps less visible, and hopefully this will grow in the field. And I wanted to end by turning to the word recontextualization as a final thought, just before we move on to the final slide. So the way I've used the work comes from Basil Bernstein, who, as people who know his work, know he's a sociologist, was a sociologist. And the point that he makes is that recontextualization is a process that's happening all the time. So certainly in curriculum, there's recontextualization from one practice to another, from one discipline to another. And that in that process, power is at work and ideology is at work. And I think those questions were implicit in what some people were asking is, do we know what we're doing when we're doing that, and how power and ideology are at work? And I think it's our job as researchers to be aware of that and to make that more visible and to be more reflexive about that ourselves. And it is to Bernstein that we turn in concluding. So just the next slide, Janine, is that as we started, and I talked about how we came to grips with the fact that this isn't a field as any sort of singularity that we could survey, we did struggle in the end with how do we describe it? Is it a domain? What is it? And we turned to a notion that Bernstein talked about and wrote about in 2000, where he distinguished between disciplines and what he called regions. And while disciplines are more singular, specialized, more discrete discourses and knowledges, regions he describes as encompassing of multiple perspectives. And there are a number of ways in which he characterizes a region that we think is quite useful in perhaps taking this work forward. Carry on, Janine. So the first thing is that regions recontextualize disciplines. So in a region, you would have a number of disciplines coming together that have each been recontextualized, and it makes a broader field. So it's no longer singular. The second thing about a region is that they're often Janus-faced. They are Janus-faced. They're not only about disciplinary integrity and disciplinary homogeneity, they're responsive to practices and fields external to the discipline or to the discourse. And with that comes agents and their interests. And you can see Bernstein talking about power and ideology being at work. And so, final point, of course, it's fraught then with tensions and dialectics. And that what constitutes our work makes it so exciting and interesting. And engenders to us to be responsible in how we go about our work. Thanks, Janine. Oh, just finally, before Janine and we conclude, Janine, I think it would be useful to ask Luc and yourself if there's anything else you want to add.
Let's go with Luc.
Thank you, Jill, and your conclusion was very interesting and clear. Just perhaps one thinking. I mean, our three models allow us to explore an emerging field, but do this exploration allows us to go beyond our three models to reach a kind of meta model. And I think it's an essential thing. As Kenneth said, the concept can be understood only within a model. I think that we run out of time to try to design from our three models a new model. But the time was enough to make us perceive the weak points of our models and the direction in which it could be enriched or deepened. And finally, I think that this special issue and this seminar provides a means to deepen in the future our respective models, allowing them to better dialogue and perhaps consider a meta model giving new ways to explore a field for the moment where it bursts. Yes, that's my thinking, just as a prospective thinking.
I think I will make a comment about the process of moving this sort of work through to publication, to the place of publication, which is also a process of communication and translation. And it was very interesting to me to observe the process of paper, you know, as a reviewer. Often I haven't edited a journal, so as a reviewer, supporting and working with authors to bring their ideas to a place where they're to a place of publication that's a very important element of the work that researchers do, and it's invisible because what the field sees is the finished pieces. But I think when I think about early career researchers, and when I think about a field struggling with new and complex ideas, that the invisibility of that sort of work is a little bit of a shame. I mean, I think it's very important to understand the development of a piece of a paper as a final product to be really the result of a complex iterative process of communication. That's my final comment. So, and we are past time, so I'm going to advance to the last slide that just thanks everyone, our presenters, Laura for helping us out with the chat, Gabrielle for making this all possible, and for all of you and your really thoughtful questions and comments in the chat, and for just your participation today.
And congratulations to all, and thank you, organizers. Very interesting and inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, especially to the guest editors. but of course to really, you said it very nicely, you didn't anticipate so much work. Yes, it is a lot of work, and I have to say you have to love it. Otherwise, it would be very difficult. But luckily, there are so many people around the world who love to edit a special issue. And I'm really most thankful for all these wonderful guest editors with whom I had a chance to work in the past, with you, which was a very interesting and wonderful experience, and with, of course, the coming issues. So thank you very much. It is a lot of work, but I think it's worth. So I thank you. We had nearly 140 participants, which is really a huge audience. So yes, thank you for joining us. We certainly will continue these webinars, and I hope that we are able to distribute it as broadly as possible. So thank you, and yes, you have the chance to hear the recording of this webinar in 1 week at another time at the ZDM website. So thank you very much, and yes,
thank you.
See you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, Janine.
Good night to some. Have a
Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning. Good night.
Yes. Good evening.
Thanks for sticking with us.
Thank you, Miss.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miss.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah.